Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Good to see so many of you who've come along to a rather different venue from the Putney Society's usual one. But when I was asked to make a talk about Putney's churches and realised that we normally meet, there were so many of them, we needed 2 talks, which is great, and we normally meet in basically a non-conformist church. So since we have the Reverend Brutus Green here as president of the society, we asked him very nicely, could we do our Anglican bit in a proper Church of England church? And he kindly said yes. And can I ask you just to do the sort of necessary bits before we get underway?
Very good to be in a proper church. Definitely shouldn't say that. But a very warm welcome to St Margaret's. Lovely to have you here. Of course, St Margaret's is very interesting. It has, and perhaps you'll touch on this, we have ranged from being a non-conformist chapel, a private chapel, to being Church of England. So we contain all traditions here. But practically, there's a fairly accessible loo over there, and you can go through to our new parish centre and see a little bit of recent history, where there are many more loos in the kitchen. There is a hearing loop, so if that helps you, you can switch to the T position, and the hearing loop should be working fine, and tell me if it isn't. Tonight is, of course, streamed, so you'll be able to look back if there's something that you slightly miss, and check it out on YouTube. But it's a delight to host the Putney Society after our garden party in the summer, so I will hand over to you, and thank you very much for this evening.
Sorry, I forgot to thank you for the garden party as well. Anyway, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Our topic for this evening, sorry.
I'm just going to lift you up.
Okay. Right, volume adjusted. Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As I say, thank you for turning out into an unusual for the society venue. Good to see so many people this far west. Because for those of us who do actually live at this end of Putney, it's nice to face the fact I've got a 10-minute walk home instead of a 20-minute walk home tonight. Anyway, welcome. Our topic, as the buildings panel, we know that many of the most interesting buildings in Putney, even if they're not ones where we have to worry about planning applications and so on, many of the most interesting buildings in Putney, you want to, thank you, Laura, are actually our churches, of which there are rather a lot, as it turned out. So we divided this talk into 2. Brutus mentioned very briefly the multiple histories of this building and its 3 different occupants. But believe me, when it comes to chasing the Unionists around Putney in our second talk, everybody seems to have shared everybody else's space at some point. It gets quite interesting. But tonight, we're going to begin at the beginning, where worship in Putney began, of course, at St Mary the Virgin Church next to Putney Bridge. But before I bring Laura on to talk about that, just a brief history. So, yes, that's for a very long time indeed. We have records from the 13th century of a church at the bottom of Putney High Street, as we now know it, by Putney Bridge, as obviously wasn't there then. But there was a ferry crossing, of course, which is why it is in that location. And the oldest extant bit of the church you can see now dates from 1450, which means it's the only pre-Victorian element we're going to talk about tonight. Everything else comes later. Because Putney remained quite a small, if interesting and influential place, really until the railways and the 19th century huge expansion of London. So it got by pretty much on one church for a very long time. But then everything changed from 1846 onwards when the Richmond and Battersea Junction Railway, briefly so-called, opened in 1846, and suddenly a lot of southwest London became accessible in new ways. And really, most of Putney happened in the following 50 years. And that vast expansion led to a need for many more churches, some of which are still with us. In fact, everything the Church of England has built is still with us, with the exception of one chapel, which we'll come back to. But many others have been and gone. And again, that's for next time. So, as I say, at the beginning, it's St Mary's. And Laura, would you like me to run your PowerPoint in exchange?
Okay, so this is for the slightly vertically challenged up here.
Yeah. Sorry, can I introduce to everybody Laura Paul-Blaise, who is a stalwart member of the Buildings Panel. And I couldn't resist giving you the one with the connection for later, both the oldest, because you are Buildings Risk Officer for the Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings, and because of the SPAB connection, I couldn't resist giving you the one with the William Morris connection. Thank you for stepping in on two of them and to stop these people being bored by hearing my voice all night. Thank you.
Oh, very welcome. I'd just like to say that I actually have just been to Japan on holiday, so I'm about 8 or 9 hours ahead. So if I make even less sense than I normally do, please forgive me. And there's a little bit of technical wizardry going on. I will do. Is that better? Perfect. Okay, let's get... Right, I need a nice picture. All right, okay. Okay, I assume that everyone recognises this one. St Mary's Church, bottom of the High Street. It is listed a grade 2 star, not grade 1, as many assume. And this is likely due to its extensive rebuilding in the 1830s. So both St Mary's and All Saints are valued the same. And they're valued highly at grade 2 star because of their architectural merits, but also because of their historical, in St Mary's case in my view, and aesthetic associations in All Saints. So, like many old buildings, its origins are uncertain, but a church in Putney, as Andrew said, was first recorded in 1291. There was an ordination recorded there. The ordination was in 1302, but it was first recorded in 1291. Before that, we think that there was a chapel of ease under St Mary's, Wimbledon, because both Wimbledon and Putney were part of the See of Canterbury. And a chapel of ease is created so that a place of worship is nearby. It's within easy reach of most people, which, of course, their main mode of transport was walking. So, right, go on to the next one. Okay, that says 1783. It's a drawing. And this shows how the church would have stood in relation to the smaller buildings around it. You can see it is massive, as most churches were. They were the biggest buildings ever. Around. And the oldest parts of the church, which Andrew mentioned, are still standing, is the 15th century tower and some of the piers or pillars within the nave. So go on to the next slide, please, as they say. This is Bishop West's Chantry Chapel. I'm afraid I couldn't get a good enough interior picture, so I went with the illustration in the book. This was built between 1515 and 1533 by Bishop West of Ely, but he was born in Putney. He rose to become chaplain to Henry VII, Henry VIII, Catherine of Aragon, and so he was a very important person. And apparently this is, I have no knowledge of this before, it's one of the very few examples of very expensive, ornate, late medieval patronage in a village church, because of course Putney was one of the villages around London. It has a very beautiful fan-vaulted roof, late perpendicular style, and the monument on the right, so I'm wary of turning away from this microphone now, the monument on the right is in honour of the bishop, and it shows the heraldic symbols, obviously, of the white rose of Henry VIII and the pomegranate of Catherine of Aragon. Next slide, please, as they say. So that should say 1797 and 1820. The 1797 drawing on the left shows the original position of the Chantry Chapel, as well as an external staircase and porch. I think you can just see the the Chantry Chapel is very obvious. The staircase may be more difficult to see. The one on the right, the 1821, is a view from Windsor Road, which is now the Lower Richmond Road. This was before the rebuilding. So this church was substantially rebuilt, apart from the tower, of course, in the 1830s by Edward Lappage. He was the son of the head gardener at Hampton Court, and eventually he became the county architect for Surrey. He's particularly known for buildings, Kingston Bridge is one of his, St John Hampton Wick is another, and St Mary's Hampton. Now, I usually would accompany this with a likeness of this chap, but there wasn't one to be found. But he was a description, slightly odd, and it says, a tall and erect gentleman, usually dressed in a tall hat with tassels. I have no idea what a tall hat with tassels is. With Hessian boots, doesn't sound particularly practical. He was exceedingly active. Anyway, he was extremely active at St Mary's. He moved Bishop West's chancel from the south to the north side. He widened and lengthened the nave. He widened the aisles, and he added galleries. So he did all of that. He designed it, redesign happened in about 1836, but he then carried out renovations to All Saints Fulham, which I didn't know about. And so there is actually a connection between the two churches on either side, which everybody thinks there is, but technically they're obviously in different parishes. Can I go on to the next slide? This is somebody you might know, Ronald Sims. So in 1973, the church was severely damaged by arson. Fire was started in the organ in the southeast gallery, and it swept through the church with the tower at the west end acting as a sort of chimney. All that remained were the tower, the walls, and most of the pillars. And the decision was made to rebuild again. This time, there was a radical remodelling of the interior of the church by Ronald Sims between 1980 and 82. Now, Sims was a noted church architect who apparently combined modernism with respect for tradition, particularly the arts and crafts movement. So there's an interesting link there with All Saints, which I'll come on to later on. And according to the art historian Pevsner, the redesign is, and I quote, a most successful, I won't even attempt to do Pevsner accent, a most successful interior of the late 20th century, making use of what could be preserved from the older building. And this is extremely high praise from Pevsner. It certainly was radical as it moved the altar from the traditional place in the east to the north side, which was unusual, but it has been done in other churches. Next slide, please. Okay. Some of you might have noticed one major omission from this talk so far. And I thought about actually not even mentioning it. I thought we'd just do the buildings panel, but then I thought I probably ought to. So the most famous event that took place in St Mary's about this time of year, but in 1647, between the 28th of October and the 8th of November was, of course, the Putney debates. The General Council of the Army had its headquarters in Putney, and the men were discussing the foundation of the Constitution, the monarchy. They were trying to link all parts of the army together. This is the famous quotation from the leader of the Levellers, Colonel Thomas Rainsborough, on the right to vote, which is summarised in an inscription in the church. And if nobody has been to see the excellent display in the church about the debates, I do encourage you to go and to learn about it, and also more about St Mary's. And the church is open every day, as is the cafe, just saying.
Thank you, Laura, for starting with what is both, in one sense, the oldest church in Putney, but actually its newest as well. Would have liked to vote for the windows, which I think are really successful too. By Alan Younger, some of whose glasswork we also managed as a society to help save when they were going to pull down the entrance to the Putney Exchange. Anyway, as I mentioned before, and you can see above, come the 19th century, suddenly Putney was booming, the population was booming, the Church of England was booming too. Everybody, well, I don't really need to introduce probably Victorian England to this audience, but you get the idea. And as the population grew, the houses spread across the fields, then more churches were needed. And those of you who came to my quiz last year, on the top, headed, don't look up, will realize that the middle of this slide is in fact borrowed direct from that. Except this time, instead of asking you to recognize them, I've simply put some dates up to show the progress of seriously Gothic, seriously spired churches across Putney, but it wasn't only the seriously spired, as we're going to see, but very much a tendency to follow the population and accommodate the population. Although, interestingly enough, we all think that, feel that the 19th century was rather like the sort of enforced religion of the Tudor period, but actually a survey in 1902 showed that across all of Putney's churches, possibly only 1/3 of those eligible to do so did actually turn up that particular Sunday. So there's work to be done then, that is still to be done now, as the churchman behind the back will attest. Anyway, so moving on, if we might, please. Just to put this in perspective, Putney in 1859, this is a few years after the arrival of the railway, but of course that railway was also opened to lots of other places. The expansion didn't happen immediately, it didn't happen everywhere. In fact, there's not much of the Putney you recognise yet. There's a fully built-up street all the way up from St Mary's, up the High Street, just beyond the Upper Richmond Road, where John Temple Leader, a man who led quite a lot of development of Putney at that stage, or his descendants did, certainly in West Putney, had just started developing in St John's Avenue, and being a good Victorian, knew that if his suburb was to succeed, it would need a decent church. So he gave it a more than decent church, if I can say so. Then moving onwards and upwards, as you can see, I've marked 4 other places where there is a church now, but wasn't then. So they're all coming. Next, please. Right. So, starting with St John the Evangelist, the first of the expansion. Putney had become its own parish, separated from Wimbledon in 1860, but the year before, 1859, also the date of the map you've just seen, is when Leader built, or had built, I should say, St John the Evangelist. He got in an architect called Charles Lee and his son Sidney Williams Lee. Lee had been a pupil of John Nash, but didn't do anything you might recognise as John Nash at all, but built in the then very fashionable decorated Gothic style, because the discussion led by the likes of Pugin says that decorated Gothic was the only pure Christian style. Gothic was the pure Christian style. Anything that the Romans had done couldn't possibly be Christian, so it had to be Gothic. And Gothic must, like all things, have developed from its early days, grown to its finest like a flower, and then withered away before dying. And therefore the middle period Gothic was the purest and best Gothic, which meant that there's an awful lot of 14th or 15th century Gothic churches built in the 19th century all over England. That's why they're there. That church, as you can see, has fascinating on the outside, lots and lots of nice bits, rebuilt Let me get my dates right. 1859 to start with. The tower followed in 1865. They grew into the chancel and aisles, so widened it, as happened to almost every church we're going to talk about today, in 1888. And unfortunately, then lost all their windows to a World War II bomb. So there's not much interior that's fascinating anymore. Sadly for the church, the population of Putney may have grown and stabilised, and lots of people were moving in. By the 1970s, were moving into new blocks of flats where single houses had been at Putney Hill, but they weren't going to church. They hung on to St John's for long enough for it to act as the parish church after the tragic fire you've just heard about at St Mary's. But thereafter it was declared redundant. Fortunately for the church and for Putney, the proposal to pull it down and replace it with a block of flats, which it was seriously mooted at the time, didn't happen because the Polish Catholic congregation in Wimbledon, who were renting a church, were also renting a church that wasn't big enough and were desperately on the look for something to do about that. And word reached them that Putney had one to spare. So they bought it from us, looked after it, and are still there. So thank you to them for taking over. Meanwhile, I think it's time to go back, Laura, if I might, to your presentation for the next of our expansions, the one that didn't appear in my threefold, because it's not got a spire. We want to talk about your presentation on All Saints, if I may.
Slight pause for technical stuff again. I'll happily talk about the Line Stevens Mausoleum because I did a dissertation on that, but that's a specialist. It's not a church. Yeah. Next slide, please. Yes. Ah, there it is. Okay, hands up who doesn't know All Saints Putney Common. Most of you will be familiar with this, so please forgive me. I'm going to just do a brief overview. That's relatively plain, early, Gothic, Victorian, very plain. Next slide, not so plain. Yeah, that's what's inside. So the slightly plain exterior gives way to a richly decorated interior. Painted roof, polychrome brickwork, wonderful stained glass windows, and I didn't mention the ones at St Mary's because I want to talk about them here. These ones here. And this is why it's listed Grade 2 star, denoting a particularly important building of special interest. I didn't say before, but only about 5% of listed buildings in England are Grade 2 star, so this is quite important. The building, as Andrew was saying, this particular building reflected the expansion of Putney in the 19th century and the need to service an increasing number of parishioners. Next slide, please. And in particular, poor people of Putney. I know these aren't poor people, but I couldn't find an actual picture of poor people in Putney. So 1868, the vicar of St Mary's, Robert Henley, called for a new free church in the west of the parish for the poorer people of Putney. In St Mary's, you had to rent your pew, and these pews are usually ranked in social order. At All Saints, you put into the collection whatever you could afford. And it was built on land donated by Earl Spencer, this chap with the beard, hence the Spencer Arms nearby. The chancel, however, was funded by the vicar's mother, Lady Henley, a sister of the former Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel. So she was quite well connected, which led to, probably, I'm just surmising here, the connections may have led to the appointment of the renowned the Anglican church architect, George Edmund Street, commonly known as G.E. Street. That's him, another chap. No, next one. That's him. Another chap with a beard, but looking like G Street this time. He was primarily known as a church architect and a great supporter of free churches, which might be one of the reasons he got involved. But he also designed the other building you can see on this slide, the Royal Courts of Justice in the Strand. So he was a leading architect in the Victorian Gothic revival style. You can see quite a lot of Victorian Gothic revival in the courts. building. He was had been apprenticed to George Gilbert Scott of St Pancras Station, Albert Memorial, various buildings around here as well. Street was involved in the design and the redesign of churches up and down the land, hundreds in Cornwall, hundreds in Oxfordshire, and probably one of the leading church architects of his day. Next slide. However, he also drew in a few friends. A young William Morris, chap on the left, again a beard. He was one of G. Street's pupils, and Street collaborated with the William Morris Company, whose Merton Abbey works you can see, I think, slightly idealised in the painting of the pond at Merton Abbey by Pocock. Next one. He also had, in addition to William Morris, he had Sir Edward Burne-Jones, a pre-Raphaelite painter and one of the Morris Company's principal designers, to design the windows and the reredos, more of which anon. So William Morris was living in Hammersmith at the time. Burne-Jones was living just over the bridge in Fulham. And I have a suspicion that both men were much more connected in the building of All Saints than in many of their more distant commissions where they may just have sent people off to do it. Next slide, please. Now, although the windows look as if they were all designed and installed at the same time, they were actually installed over a 40-year period. So most of the cartoons, as window designs are called, they were created for other churches. 7 of them were designed by Burne-Jones, were actually intended for Calcutta Cathedral in India. Next one. I'm not going to go through each of the windows, it's far too long, but the majority, including the baptistry window and the east window, these ones, were designed by Burne-Jones. Only 6 were designed by Morris, and I'm not going to work out which ones they were for the moment. Next, please. Yeah, I hope you can see this in its glory. The altarpiece, the reredos, is particularly stunning, and it was part of Street's original design for the church. It's a triptych, so there's 3 pieces of wood which can be folded shut during Lent, and it was painted to Street's original, to his design, by John Spencer Stanhope, a friend of Burne-Jones. And if you haven't seen it recently, the recent restoration shows the painting of the Holy City surrounded by archangels in all its splendour. It's absolutely fantastic. However, and this may be slightly idiosyncratic, next slide, this is one of my favourite bits of the church, personal favourite. It's the painted roof. It was by George Frederick Bodley, another very well-known Gothic revival architect, and the designer of some of William Morris's wallpaper. I think you can see sort of echoes of Morris there. And some of you might remember the arson attack in 1993, which badly damaged the roof, I remember very clearly. Police caught the arsonist, and I remember the debate in the church as to whether to repair the roof. Thankfully, we did at considerable cost. So All Saints is open for public visits on the first Saturday of every month between 10 and 2. I strongly recommend a visit if you haven't been there for a while. I've got some leaflets next to the wine. There's also a leaflet about their current organ campaign, which I did promise that I would let you know about. There was originally a pipe organ, and G. Street was a chorister. So the pipe organ was put in within 6 months of it being consecrated. Given the windows took about 40 years to get, he got the pipe organ in very quickly. But that was replaced by a digital organ, which has since died. And there is a fine tradition of music making at All Saints. So from concerts at midday to choirs, and they want me to publicise the concert on the 23rd of November in aid of the organ campaign. So I promised I would do that. That is it.
Thank you, Laura. Just to add one point on that, if you do want to go and have a look at all the lovely stuff we've just been talking about, the 1st of November, this coming Saturday, is the last Saturday they will be open this year, because it gets too cold and too dark and all of that, and the church, with something called Christmas coming up, has other things on its mind than welcoming visitors. So if you want to go and have a good look, and I do thoroughly recommend it. Meanwhile, the Putney and Roehampton Society, as we sometimes have to remind ourselves we are, covers not just Putney town, the centre of, but also other parts of, basically other parts of Southwest 15. We'll catch up a little later with the fact that Putney Parish ends so rapidly to the east of the High Street that East Putney Station is in fact not in Putney, according to parishes. But we will sneak a bit that way. But meanwhile, we need to think about the poor folks of Roehampton. You may recall my map earlier on with Roehampton tucked up in the top right-hand corner, Putney down bottom left, and it was quite a long, but for a very long time, the villagers of Roehampton, of whom admittedly there were not that many, a couple of hundred for most of the early period we're talking about, had to walk across the fields every Sunday to go to Putney to worship. But in fact, anybody from the far west of Putney's parish was also had quite a hike. And probably, yes, happens these days. I suspect a few of them sneaked out into barns. But but Roehampton was an unusual place, we put it this way. What makes it interesting, what one or two people here I recognize have heard me talking about SPAB talks, is that it was a place for rich people to have their country villa, their out-of-town weekend place, their summer place, because it was upwind of Putney, yes, that's right, upwind of the City of London and the smoke. Near enough you could get there same day. Up a hill, the Rifts have always lived up hills if they can possibly do it, because it's always drier and more congenial. So there were an awful lot of great houses, some of which are still there. So the first bits of worship that happened there, while the poor folk who lived in the village, who did, serviced these houses, had to walk to Putney, the owner of the great house, of course, had a private chapel in the house, which was supposedly a private chapel. But it was discovered, certainly during the 18th century, that he was inviting many of his wealthy neighbours to come to Sunday service too. Much as was said, one report puts it, much to the distress of Putney's minister, who had to do all his parochial work in Roehampton, but didn't get the collections for the wealthier residents because they were all staying at home and worshipping elsewhere. So even then, having it in someone's house was felt a little inconvenient. So in 1777, we get the building top left is erected on Roehampton Lane in the grounds of Roehampton Great House, by then Grove House, and as a private enterprise run by a priest who rented the building, rented out pews, and basically made enough money from collections and pew rents to pay himself. This lasted for quite some time, but it was felt that the rest of the parish deserved better. So in 1843, that was bought out, shut down, pulled down, and on its place, of course, a nice little bit of Gothic, bottom left, was built as a public daughter chapel to St Mary's at first, but not for long, because they had a decent chapel, people were turning out, So in 1846, Roehampton became its own parish. Really not very long did Putney spend covering Roehampton after that. That lasted a bit. The population, as everywhere else, was busy expanding, although suburbia came to Roehampton really quite late by comparison with Putney itself. But the population was expanding. The church, even the 1840s one, even, dare one say it, can we have the next slide, please? When 50 years old, was showing signs of needing some repair. So the vicar knocked on the doors of one or two, or probably caught them on their way out from Sunday service, one or two of his wealthier parishioners and said, a story we're all familiar with, I need some money for the roof, please, or whatever the words exactly were. He started with a man called J. Pierpont Morgan, who anybody in the banking industry will have heard about, who happened to live in Dover House, now gone, in Roehampton. Morgan, generous fella, said, yes, I'll give you £1,000. Remember, this is the 1890s, so this is 20 years' pay for your maid, or a substantial sum to anybody, but only if you put it towards a new church. This little place is too small. The moment some of his other wealthy neighbours heard about it, they too felt they had to catch up. So chunks of £1,000 were turning up in short order and very quickly, and suddenly there was way more than they needed for a bit of repair, and so they were able to buy themselves a very grand indeed brand new church. After asking Earl Spencer, who's been mentioned already, but not the same Earl Spencer by this time, to donate a little corner of the common, tucked in between the bit he'd given to various schools. So that's why the church sits on a really very confined site. It has no churchyard. It is straight off the street. There's almost nothing at the back. And they filled the site with a very grand church indeed. The spire is 200 feet high, for no better reason than they could afford it, I'm sorry to put it bluntly. And here it is. So, the architect was a fellow called G.H. Fellows Sprynn. I haven't managed to find much else about him, so we have a Corsham stone church, back to stone, back to a spire. So this is our second great stone spire. We have one more still to come. And lots of very nice stuff on the inside. I mean, some of that would look actually remarkably familiar if you look at All Saints. It's the same spirit of decorate it and then decorate it again. And I strongly recommend a visit. But I do recommend visiting these churches, but I'm sure we're not, hope I'm not taking your parish away, because we're going to be talking about your church next. Key parts are most distinctive element apparently is the rood screen, which you can see at the middle of the top photo. Instead of having a low chancel screen, it's as tall as the rest of the church, following apparently a medieval precedent from Essex. Right, that's Roehampton. And now we're going to move on to a familiar setting. St Margaret's, we've mentioned that a perpetual quest for more churches as the parish expanded. I also mentioned, of course, that Putney expanded slowly westwards, very slowly indeed. Everything immediately around here, if you'd been here in 1910, was still open. The other side of Putney Park Lane, where there is now a council estate, built in the 1920s, was the grounds of Dover House, we've just mentioned, which is why it's the Dover House estate. The grounds of a house called Putney Park, which is actually still there, surrounded by the little cottage houses. And on this side of Putney Park Lane, there were several other grand houses. The The land we are on belonged to a house called Granard. Granard stood up where the school is, but this was the bottom of its garden, and where we are now. And the occupant of the house in 1859 or 1873, depending on whose report I read, a Colonel Alexander Kroll, who lived in Granard, commissioned a private Baptist chapel. This building, or at least parts of this building, that you now stand in. As it was built, I'm sorry about the slightly misty grey picture, it was rather smaller than it is now. In fact, I think I'm probably standing roughly where it ended. It was also, and I'm going to have to ask you to imagine this, instead of walking in on the level, as you did tonight, by the way, it's the only church in Putney where you can, although St Mary's has managed to sort things out with the extension. There was a very large, this was a private Baptist chapel, but a full Baptist building nonetheless. There was a full immersion tank, roughly where my audience is sitting tonight. The floor was up here somewhere to allow basically the tank still on this floor, and the floor you would all be sitting on was up here somewhere. And there are quite a lot of steps, as you can see, just vaguely, leading up. So you would walk in up a large flight of stairs through double doors and in to a level above the doors you see now, with a meeting hall in the space behind. Anyway, the Baptists didn't stay that long, as has already been mentioned. In 1879, it was passed on to the Presbyterians. I think this is basically because of a change of resident in Granard. The Presbyterians were looking for a church in Putney, and they found this one, which the Baptists were didn't quite like. But they then, of course, made some alterations, basically got rid of that tank because they didn't need it. The Presbyterians didn't stay very long. They stayed 20 years because they, in turn, were busy building themselves a brand new church that used to stand at the bottom of Briar Walk. But that church appears in our next talk because it never was Church of England. They were here briefly. They moved down the road to their brand new church, which sadly is no longer with us, in 1899, leaving this empty, unloved. But the parish of Putney was noticing that people were expanding westward. West Putney has crept its way up. The Edwardian houses, many of you passed through on your way here tonight if you came in from St Margaret's Crescent rather than Putney Park Lane. They were slowly working their way westwards. The parish needed a church further west to serve these people, and noticed that sitting empty on Putney Park Lane was this. So they took the then owner of the house called Granard, who still owned the church as a feature at the bottom of the garden, a man called Seth Cross, who kindly, after much negotiation, said, all right, here you are, I'll give it to you. And so he gave the Church of England this church. They then sent in an architect called A.G. Humphrey to get rid of those steps, get rid of the tank, and put the floor back down where you now see it, but not do much in the way of decoration. This is by now 20th century, not the 19th. The fashion for polychrome decoration and all of that had passed. So we have an interesting contrast, a more austere but still welcoming church. What then happened, of course, is that over here, following the First World War, the London County Council, looking for places to build homes for heroes, bought up the great houses that were sitting 2 miles to the west of us, and replaced 2 houses with 1,200 over the course of the 1920s, which meant that suddenly this end of the parish had quite a lot of congregation. So much so that this church was made its own parish in 1924 and altered to cope with the new influx in the following years in 1925-6, where a firm called Forsyth and Moore added that. If you look at the bottom right-hand picture, you will notice that we've got an essentially stone church on the outside, the main part, and a brick church wrapped around the end of it here. But not all was plain and modernist. We have, in fact, some 1929 windows. I was going to ask Brutus to tell me, you mentioned something in passing I wouldn't manage to find about a contradiction in terms with the windows. I also wonder if you might like to say anything more about your own church, sir.
I can do very briefly. So really the church finished at these pillars here where you've got the speakers. It did come in, and then there was a sort of like little thing sort of extending towards where I am now. So yeah, all this was then built after. The windows, you'll notice these windows, it's impossible to see the windows tonight because it's dark. But basically, we've got stained glass windows in this part of the church. In this part of the church, the windows are all, well, they were originally all greenish glass. There was a bomb, and so if you notice clear glass, that's where the bomb has been replaced. But the windows here are all coloured. And one of the interesting things is, in living memory, everyone I know who has been in this church for a long time would say that it's quite a low church tradition. But the windows seem to tell a slightly different story, because if you look at all the saints when it's light, you'll notice they're all wearing these sort of highly decorated copes. And then if you go into the Lady Chapel, which is actually, these are Burleson and Grills, who was quite a famous, and over here we've got Kemp Studio did the windows in here. But you'll notice that the angel Gabriel is wearing a chasuble, which is quite high church, and you have the Latin for the Hail Mary prayer. So I'm slightly curious as to what sort of churchmanship was happening here in the 1920s and where that all changed. But it's quite interesting.
The expanded congregation, the estate was built for ordinary working people. So these were council houses to rent. So they were tradesmen and postmen and people like that.
Yeah.
Forming the congregation who were worshipping in front of these windows.
Yes. But yeah, high church, yeah. I suppose high church, it's not necessarily related to social class, is it? But yeah, it is, I think, part of perhaps the Church of England trying to stamp its churchmanship on what was a very plain Protestant chapel, perhaps.
Okay, thank you. All right, but this is not quite the end of the story, so we can move on. I said the Putney Society covers Southwest 15, and that Putney Parish actually ends on the line of the Putney Ditch, which, if you trace it, is the dip in Lytton Grove, for those who know what we're talking about. It runs just this side, literally just this side of East Putney Station, so that the Carlton Drive is in Putney, but the station is in Wandsworth, according to parish boundaries. But we, as a society, cover Southwest 15, so I thought I'd better mention the stuff that falls into that interesting zone in between. I got you 3 churches that I can find out about, 2 of which I can find out very little indeed. In fact, the top left-hand picture is the only known photograph I can produce of St Stephen's Mission Church facing Wandsworth Park. Nothing else remains. It was bombed completely in the 1940s, and there's a block of flats on the site. And I have no further information about it whatsoever, except that, notice that the other one on the screen is also St Stephen's. They are about 400 yards apart, and yes, they were both in action simultaneously, so they are not one church moving to the other, because on the maps from the late 19th century, they are definitely both there at the same time. And there was a good Gothic-y looking Victorian, I suspect, church of St Stephen's in Mansfield Road with 900 seats, according to one of the maps I looked at, but is not the church that is there now. There's something much, much more modest, and they're so modest that I can't find out very much about it from their website. Sorry. So all I can do is offer you. But we have one more grand church to finish. It was marked on my map, the top left-hand corner, Bry Tibbetts Corner, just and only just outside Putney Parish in West Hill, and I need the missing PowerPoint. Spire number 3 from the collection I showed you earlier. It was the one in the middle. So it's becoming a bit of a repeat story. It's not the original church for the parish. The original church for Wandsworth Parish is still there, cowering in between all the tower blocks on Wandsworth High Street on the one-way system. But it too ended up with daughter churches as the population expanded outwards away from the centre. So up at the top of West Hill, we have a splendid object. Next, please. So once again, we have got a chapel of ease, but don't be fooled by the word chapel. This is rather like the one we just saw in the Holy Trinity of Roehampton. Holy Trinity on West Hill is a very grand church indeed. Outclassing the church it was a subsidiary to, in a sense, but not far. And is still part of, in this case, is still part of the original parish. They decided they needed a church. They got land donated by the Beaufort Estate, who were the major landowner in the area, and again, rather like John Temple Leader, we saw at the beginning of the talk, giving land, endowing a church so that his development immediately around it would attract the right class of people for his 8-bedroom, 4-story houses, as they were at the time. The same story basically applies here. We get a tall stone spire on a square, ragstone, back again, face church. We've got Kentish ragstone for most of the walls with bar stone dressings, slate roof. The architect was a man called John M.K. Hahn, who did the church itself in 1872. Then they expanded in 1887, and if you could, thank you. There's the dedication stone, telling me all about it, and for once, says he, mentioning the architect. Doesn't happen often enough. Anyway, the tower and the last little bits and the spire followed 16 years later, 1888, in order to catch up with them. And it's what I like about that church in particular is the fact that on Putney Heath Lane, you've got this wonderful vista with the lane disappearing down over the Putney ditch and back up again, tree-lined, and at the top of the hill, the tower. And that, I think, is our last church for tonight. So, thank you very much, and I'll try to take any questions. And otherwise, otherwise, just say thank you for coming. And if you exactly stuff we've missed.
One of the lovely things about this church is that wasn't mentioned is with the steep entrance, and there's this obvious. I've always wondered if I could put another window in the back wall because there's this huge blank space. Because obviously the entrance was originally much higher, but what it meant was that the crypt was huge, like in terms of the elevation, whereas now you're nearly bumping your head if you go down to the crypt. But in the crypt they had a Putney debating society in the 19th century, and Ramsay MacDonald spoke there, which is a lovely bit of history.
What I can certainly do is add lots and lots of famous names who cropped up as turning up in various Putney churches. But yeah, Ramsay MacDonald, absolutely right, yes. Debating here.
Yeah. So the top of where the door is now, that's the original entrance. Baptisms.
Can you tell us anything about the roof over the altar? It's curiously sort of, well, yes, it is curious, but equally quite rural.
Yes. No, I can't. We know who designed it, but we don't know why they made it like that. And sadly, there's nobody around to ask. But clearly, this is very much showing how that end of the church, as you rightly said, the Church of England stamping a bit of grandeur on the humble Protestant church it had taken over, or the humble Baptist chapel originally even, but it had taken over. So yes, doing all of the extension a bit grander, but they actually perfectly serviceable, really rather nice roof we have above our heads here, which manages to do the job with the minimum amount of timber required, I would suggest. And is all the nicer for it, in my humble opinion.
I'll put you on the list of donors for when we have to get a new roof in. Any other questions? Right.
Hi. Hello, I was just going to ask, how did Chapels of Ease work? Did the minister from the mother parish or whatever have to go there, or would they have...
Sorry, how they...
Well, did they have their own minister, or was it the minister from the mother church or whatever?
Well, these days some churches share their ministers because they've got more buildings and people. But at that stage, there seemed to be an awful lot of ordained people, not all of whom ran churches, but there were plenty of ministers to go around. Basically, it was minister-led. You know, if your parish was doing all right, you've got plenty of people to staff it. You just hadn't got enough seats for the people you wanted to preach to. So sometimes you made your church a bit bigger, and sometimes, and this has been true, every single church we've talked about tonight was expanded at some point, often quite soon after being finished. Starting with St Mary's with the 1836 reconstruction, which then developed side aisles, you know, where everyone, this expanded on being taken over. So there doesn't seem to be a shortage of ministers, so yes, everybody had one, basically, or had a team. And then there were visiting preachers. Another famous name who comes up here, Lewis Carroll, otherwise the Reverend Charles Dodgson. Oxford Don most of his time, but his uncle lived in Putney, in a house on the Putney Bridge Road, which, believe it or not, in the late 19th century, still had a 9-acre garden, which backed on to the large gardens of some of the houses that still survived on the high street before they got turned into the streets that many of you now live in. So he led the service at St Mary's in 1862 on one occasion when visiting, and many, add to the name. I have another story. We were talking about the Putney debates earlier. A little remark from Pevsner about how Cromwell's army were not exactly nice about churches. It was Parliament versus the Crown. It was not Protestants versus Catholics, that dispute. And his scathing remark, they sat around the communion table with their hats on.
Oh, just to add, one church in Putney that never did have to be extended, admittedly not Church of England, is Putney Methodist Church, which is so vast, built for 1,000, that it was never did have to be expanded. But my question...
Yes, the answer on that one is that it was built way bigger than it needed to be, because there was a very rich Methodist left some money for churches to be built, for 10 churches to be built, but they had to be 1,000-seaters. So to get his money at all, they had to build one that big.
Right.
Pleased to see they're still looking after it and still living in it. No.
That was 1872, by the way. And so Barnes Methodist Church, presumably similar, but equally vast. But no, my question was, can you speculate where the stone might have come from for Putney's churches? The ragstone, Kentish ragstone.
All over the place. I specifically know about the church on West Hill, that it's Kentish ragstone, and I suspect you'll find quite a lot of that in many Victorian church in the London area, because they wanted to build them in stone, because Gothic somehow had to be in stone, because again, ancient parish churches always were. That's partly because brick didn't really happen between the Romans leaving and the 16th century. It was forgotten. It was something that people didn't do. They made tiles for roofs, but they didn't do stone. They didn't do brick. So a lot of our surviving older parish churches in the south are still in stone, which had to be hauled considerable distances in many cases. But no, I don't know specifically about the other Putney churches. But we are talking in most cases of the railway age, so it wasn't quite so difficult to get the stone to Putney from wherever they sourced it, whether that was Bath or Kent or even further afield.
My question is about, are you going to cover the church that the Huguenots used on Wandsworth High Street? I guess it's not in Putney's parish, but I just thought it was always an interesting bit of history.
It
is not a lot known about it.
You're right, it's not Putney Parish, which is why I didn't, or even vaguely Putney, or Southwest 15, or any other excuse to roll it into this, because, Wandsworth's got a fine old parish church of its own. It's got the Quakers almost across the road. It had the Huguenots up the hill on East Hill. Their churchyard survives, but their church does not. And I'm afraid I don't know much about it. But I suspect there's a book somewhere by Dorian Gerhold, who is still Putney's greatest historian and still chairs the Wandsworth Historical Society. So I'm sure they know. but I don't, I'm afraid.
I didn't know actually that I was not in the Putney parish until tonight, but I do live in East Putney. So I do come to the Putney Society, but I'm not in the parish. But don't forget me, please.
The Putney Society is a broad church, if you'll excuse the expression. We represent South West 15, basically. Putney, Roehampton, and there's a cut-off. So the cut-off between the postcodes is rather further towards Wandsworth than the old parish line.
It just occurs to me that there are often burial grounds associated with churches, and you haven't mentioned any of those. You've got the Putney burial ground just off the Upper Richmond Road. Was that originally associated with the church?
Well, St Mary's has a burial ground, though not all of the burial ground it once had, because some of it was taken for road widening when the bridge was enlarged. Some of it disappeared under the various extensions. After that, when that was full, a separate burial ground away from the church was bought and run on the Upper Richmond Road. That is still there. After that was full, they found themselves one on Putney Lower Common. And these days, the deceased of Putney who wish to be buried have to go to Roehampton Vale. So the simple answer is that, yes, this private chapel has no burial ground, and the same is true of all of the various daughter churches, expansion churches and whatever. They didn't have a burial ground because they were, at the time of their construction, in a parish that did, or in a parish that had already got other arrangements. So the only church with a burial ground, it's immediately outside the door, is St Mary's. Right. Is there any more? Otherwise, I'll say thank you all, and please look around you, because here is one of our nicer churches. And once again, may I thank you so much for the use of your church, and for letting us all explore. Many here. Can I do a quick straw poll? Hands up those who have been in this church before. Oh, well. So, not so much an exploration after all. Thank you all.